Now, during their 500-year rule, the Abbasids established a more authoritative rule with regard to the establishment of Islamic law, and it was under the expansion of remarkable centers of learning, which were established, that some of the greatest contributions of the Muslims to the rest of the world. They would be fostered during this time as the gaining of knowledge as a sacred trust for all Muslims. And of course, next week, in part 2 of the history of Islam, we'll go over the contributions of Muslims to the rest of the world.
Right. And
now, during this age, Islam spread to nearly all of the African and Asian nations, including the Philippines, Thailand, and Singapore. Chinese and Korean Muslims brought the religion through trade into Japan, and the establishment of Islamic rule in what is now Spain and Portugal was established.
And the Islamic state of Andalusia was nearly perfect society which encompassed all of what would later become Spanish lands. It was a place where Muslims, Christians, and Jews all lived among one another in peace and harmony. The golden age of Islam and Judaism existed at this time, and both peoples excelled greatly in finances, art, and science. The Christians were able rather to access knowledge from the libraries that had been copied from all the areas where Islam had spread. All the Abrahamic faiths reached a pinnacle of achievement together through mutual trust and cooperation in Andalusia.
Now, when I first learned about Muslim Spain, this is when I was a teenager in high school.
All right.
We learned, and we were told that the Muslims conquered the land and subjugated the people to rule, and that it eventually loosed up into community living. Nothing could be further from the truth. History tells us that when Muslims came into the land, it was because the clans, most notably the Witiza family, were living under oppression from the Visigoths on one side and the Catholics on the other. You see, most family clans in what is now Spain were not Catholic Christians, and the decree from the Vatican at that time was that any Christian who was not Catholic was a pagan and had to be forced to convert to the true Christianity or be killed and his land seized for the church to use as it saw fit. The various clans petitioned the Berbers and Muslims, who were well known for justice and tact in settling disputes.
That's right, and it was especially hard on the Jews of Hispania, as the Romans called the land, since the Catholic Church forced 100,000 of them to convert and pay a large sum of their property, or the Jews would have been forced to leave their homes and estates for good. So the Berbers agreed to come and help the people be free of this occupation after they had been asked, and rather had sent scouts to determine the situation.
Now, the amazing thing is that the Muslims ran against very little opposition as they came into the towns. The people opened the city gates and thanked them for coming to their aid. As it happened during the age of the rightly guided Caliphs, the Muslims made arrangements with each city and protected them from the Visigoths and other warlike tribes. Some cities were harder won than others, but eventually the Muslim armies pushed back the Visigoths all the way into France before the Caliphs sent word that they had finished the task. Now imagine, with the victories that they were winning, the Muslims could easily have chased the Visigoths all the way back into Germanic lands,
right,
and could have occupied all of what is now France. Considering that France is where a large number of crusaders originated, that push could well have changed the entire history of the world. Nevertheless, they had not been invited or asked to go into Franken lands, so they remained in Hispania and protected the people.
That's right, and under Muslim rule, slaves were freed, people were allowed to have their land back, and non-Catholic Christians were allowed to worship as they pleased. Jews were allowed to rebuild their temples and synagogues, and thousands of people converted to Islam within the first few days.
Just to give you an idea of the scope here, the capital of the Islamic kingdom in Hispania, which is Cordoba, was home to about 500,000 people, while the city of Paris at that time only boasted a population of 38,000. Within Cordoba, there arose the most amazing architecture that Europe had ever seen. The Muslims established the very first street lighting system in all of Europe. They built over 700 mosques, and there were nearly 1,000 public baths. Libraries were so massive that they had staffed bookbinders and translators. In fact, the hundreds of translated volumes of work from around the world still exist as a legacy of Andalusia. It was here in Cordoba that the Caliphate moved the capital and established a new age for Muslims.
That is right, and the Muslims would remain in Spain for many centuries, and before they pulled out of the region, they would leave behind massive palaces and mosques. The imprint of the Islamic quest for knowledge set Spaniards in the quest for discovery long after the Muslims had left. It was because of this that so many exploratory ships launched from Spain. Unfortunately, after the Muslims left, these exploratory ships turned into ships of conquest as the Spanish took over the lands in Central and South America and all the way around the globe to the Philippines, where they met the Muslims once again. But we'll save that part, rather, of the story for another show, Brother Simple. Alright?
Yes. Now, one of the caliphs during Andalusia had constructed a library that held over 400,000 books. Now, this is in an age when all books were copied by hand and printing presses hadn't even been conceived of. As the arts, literature, and science expanded in Andalusia, a flood of people coming from Frank and Germanic lands to study in the most prominent schools of the known world increased. It was in al-andalus that the astrolabe was invented by Muslims. This device was an essential tool for navigation and was used well into the 1600s. The doctors and medical treatment centers of Andalusia were so well known that people would travel as far away as Baghdad and beyond to receive treatment.
That's right, and two very prominent scholars of Islam were also bred with a wealth of knowledge in Andalusia, namely Muhyiddin ibn Arabi and Abu Walid ibn Rashid.
Now, the works of these two men has been instrumental in shaping the modern movement to reclaim the original vision and teaching of Islam, which is predominantly held by convert Muslims, or Balik Islam, as you call it here.
Right.
In addition to the wealth of written knowledge, Al-Andalus has a rich legacy of unique architecture, much of which was far advanced for the time. In A History of Medicinal Learning, author Victor Robinson states, Europe was darkened at sunset. Cordoba shone with public lamps. Europe was dirty. Cordoba had built 1,000 baths. Europe was covered with vermin. Cordoba changed its undergarments daily. Europe lay in mud. Cordoba's streets were paved. Europe's palaces had smoke holes in the ceiling. Cordoba's arabesques were exquisite. European nobility could not sign its name, and Cordoba's children went to school. Europe's monks could not read at the baptismal service, and Cordoba's teachers created a library of Alexandrian dimensions. Many of the ancient buildings can still be seen across Spain, where the Arabic script is carved into the stonework. Through many wars and centuries of time, these buildings remain strong, and almost all of them are still in use. The great Mosque of Cordoba still stands today. It was constructed slowly over 200 years and is so massive that a cathedral and other smaller churches were built inside the mosque. So massive and impressive is this structure that it has been referred to as a forest of columns. Inside the mosque are 50 arches, each with bands of different colored stone and all carved with intricate leaves, flowers, and other designs. There was commissioned a fantastic mihrab, which is a niche facing the Qibla, of course. This is where the imam stands to lead prayer. This was constructed with gold leaf and intricate Byzantium designs, and the wood then intertwined to become an intricate dome work where all the sections were marked with a different passage of the Qur'an, vividly painted in gold and blue. Some of these passages are still visible today. One of the glorious parts of the mosque was its minbar. This is where the imam stands or sits to deliver khutbah, or sermon to the congregation. The minbar of Cordoba was made out of 36,000 different pieces of aromatic wood such as cedar and sandalwood. The pieces were all different shapes and were expertly crafted together. These same craftsmen built a similar minbar for the Qutbiyya Mosque in Marrakesh, and it's currently housed at the El Badi Palace Museum.